2022, the Hope Forest Network would celebrate its 1 year anniversary. It would take 28 years to happen. It starts with a boy named Carl, who doesn't have the words to communicate the trauma he experienced from 4 to 9 years old. As a child, the harm expressed itself as explosive anger, disruptions in school, and social isolation. He would learn to conceal his hurt behind smiles, high-risk behavior, self-harming, and self-medication. And so he spent his teens and early 20s concealed, smiling silently in pain. It took one special conversation with one special person in the summer of 2006 to reorient his entire view of mental health. That one conversation starts a complex journey to find effective therapy and healing. Inspired by his lived experience, he'll develop a new approach to confront suicide and mental health. He'll call it proactive suicide prevention. He begins to share the proactive message in 2013, and he'll eventually train others to join him. And together, they spread proactive suicide prevention into communities, institutions, and more than 100,000 people in 50 states, 26 countries, and 17 different languages. In 2021, Carl launched the Hope for Us Network to teach people and directly educate institutions and communities how to adopt proactive suicide prevention in their spaces and lives. The network is a coalition of people passionately committed to transforming suicide prevention, which means we need to reshape mental health care. There is no magic wand, no instant fix for mental health challenges. Prevention starts with a conversation millions don't know how to begin, and far too many never got a chance to have. For 28 years, I hated that I didn't have the words to describe my harm to my parents or anyone else around me. And eventually, I'd come to hate myself the most for not having those words as a child to express my pain. It took me 28 years to find the words. 28 years concealed in silence behind smiles, self-harming coping mechanisms, and 3 ineffective suicide attempts by the age of 13. We don't have to wait for crisis. We can teach you how to recognize the earliest signs and symptoms of illness and trauma. We can train communities to be effective supports for mental health care. Together, we can disrupt the highest risk factors for suicide and mental health crisis. Together, we can save ourselves. There is hope for us. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to Camp Carl. My name is Carl Evans, and that video you just saw was a wonderful piece of production we created last spring, or spring 2023. Tell them a little bit of, obviously, the story of myself and the founding of the network. And that's kind of something that we've slowly rolled out and will make it more visible as time goes by. But we produced it really with the idea of, I personally have never really sort of told or talked a little bit about my story beyond the fact that I've been a mental health professional for almost 10 plus years now and been a mental health advocate for nearly 20. That video is personal, and yet it's also something that I think it's important to share, because when we talk about the Hope for Us Network, we're talking about a place that we say is a coalition of lived experience. And while there's clinicians and mental health professional side, there's also a lot of people connected to our organization where we bring both, whether it's living with a diagnosis or living with supporting others who've had mental health challenges, have a deep, intimate knowledge about what it means to try to navigate a modern society with mental health. And I wanted to open this inaugural episode of Camp Carl with that video because I thought it'd be a pretty simple introduction. I'll talk about myself as we go along, but the idea of this new show to our network is intended to be a place where we explore self-expression and the politics around the different social and cultural intersections connected to how we express ourselves. And why that's relevant is because when we talk about the work at the Hope for Us Network, we talk about proactive suicide prevention. And understanding what that is a concept in which we want to disrupt the highest risk factors for suicide and mental health crisis. And proactive prevention is the idea of creating education and tools to reorient our mindset, to transform how we present and approach mental health care. Suicide prevention is the end of a bigger spectrum of comprehensive mental health care. Why I like to share that video is because one of the things that we're working on right now is trying to demonstrate to people the big central challenge in mental health and suicide prevention at large. I think we sometimes think of suicide prevention as lifelines and safety nets and things like of that nature, and people who are in imminent risk of harming themselves. But we don't have an appreciation that suicide prevention is part of the bigger picture, bigger spectrum of mental health. And that's not our fault. That's actually kind of the way we socially approach things. One of the things that in Camp Carl we're going to be talking about are the concepts around the politics of self-expression, and why that's relevant with suicide prevention is that too much of the mental health discussion is compartmentalized, saying that we're okay to talk about this topic in this narrow area, and we're going to talk about this topic in this narrow area. Meaning, so suicide prevention is one conversation, and that's the conversation you have in May, Mental Health Month, or September, Suicide Prevention Month. But the rest of the year, you don't talk about it. And you don't talk about suicide when you're talking about words like wellness. Wellness is kind of being borrowed, along with the term like self-care, to be borrowed for a sort of commodity. Yoga and bath bombs and having a little slice of cake or some ice cream in a quiet downtime, and that's being called self-care. Those are things to take care of yourself and nurture your mind and bring yourself to ease and give yourself a moment of peace. But whenever people talk about self-care in the more popular mainstream way, it's not being connected to understanding how that impacts mental health, whether you're living through psychological injuries or you're living with a diagnosable illness. And it's definitely not connected to suicide prevention. People kind of want to stop short. And when you talk about sort of general mental health, the idea of talking about suicide prevention often isn't chained together too. People are willing to talk about therapy and prescriptions and things like that. But when you get to the idea of being at risk of harming yourself, that's going to be bifurcated, separated from the broader topic of mental health. And all of that is shaped by stigma. So why does self-expression connect to that too? That's a further example of how we talk about compartmentalization. The biggest thing to think about with mental health is that it's our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, but it's also connected to our cognitive processes. And all those things are kind of separated out. But I would want you to think about mental health in this way, that the only way we're able to communicate signs and symptoms of unwellness is by expressing ourselves. In the same way that a cut or a fever indicates a physiological sense of unwellness, when it comes to our mental health, our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and the way our brain functions and lets our body do things, we only communicate that through forms of expression. And you can see the way stigma works, because when you talk about self-expression, there's a cutoff point where painting, dancing, singing, literature, arts, you readily accept, yes, you're expressing yourself, you're communicating things, joy and hurt. But there's a cutoff that doesn't take that to the clinical level of talking about communicating signs and symptoms of unwellness, difficulty, trauma, potentially persistent diagnosable illnesses. So one of the reasons that it's important to sort of connect all this together is that when we talk about proactive suicide prevention, the conversation can't begin with just talking about when you arrive at a state of crisis. If you're to study the whole mental health and suicide prevention industry and the universe of academics and advocates behind it, the vast majority of our resources are front-loaded or back-loaded in a reaction. When someone is in a state of crisis, if someone communicates that they might be at risk of harming themselves, There's safety nets under bridges, hospitals and hospital beds, clinicians and 24-hour lifelines that are communicate that we access them at a crisis point. And that's actually completely backwards thinking. And it's not anyone's fault for doing that. That's just the way we've structured mental health care when it comes to crisis and harm, duress, and risk of suicide or other forms of self-harm or danger to others in society linked to mental health. So proactive prevention, by its virtue, the design is to disrupt that whole process of being reactive, of having an entire institutional practice of being on our heels, always waiting for the crisis to arise and being ready to respond. In order to do that, we've got to understand and unpack the biggest obstacles to effective mental health care and suicide prevention. And if everything's structured around the idea of reacting to crisis, then the important question to ask us there is why? Why is it reacting? Well, that's because you don't ever see the individual who's been impacted or has a mental health challenge until they cannot hide or conceal their mental health challenges. And that's it. There's nothing fancier way to explain it. There's a huge gap between the onset of a mental health challenge and the point at which they get care. And that point at which they get care, as I just demonstrated, is always in the crisis stage. It's always when their life is being severely disrupted and impacted by what's going on. And crisis can be you're at imminent risk of harming yourself, but it can also be your quality of life is starting to collapse because you cannot hide from your loved ones, peers, co-workers, that you're going through something that disrupts your thoughts, feelings, and emotions. At the network, we call that the concealment gap. This huge space between the onset of a challenge and the point at which you get care. And that whole concealment is shaped by stigmas that keep us silent. And those stigmas isn't just a buzzword. And we'll talk more about that as the show goes along. But the part we want to zero in with Camp Carl is this idea that this huge concealment gap gets broken away by us dispelling stigmas of mental health, by breaking silence, and understanding that it's okay for us to communicate our mental health. That's the broad, big picture. But the fact is that in order to communicate your self-expression, to be able to communicate early signs and symptoms, one step of that is getting educated. That's what the network is doing on a day-to-day basis. We're communicating and providing education to people to understand how to recognize the earliest signs and symptoms and the best steps or a process for determining the difference between self-care and when you need to escalate your care to a medical professional. Education is one side of it, but we also have to get through the forces that even with the knowledge of understanding something's not okay, that doesn't mean you're going to reach out for help. You're not going to reach out for help because of those stigmatizing forces that make you stay silent out of a sense of survival, fear of judgment, any number of different forces. And what stigmatizes your silence looks different for each and every person. And it's based on our geography, ethnicity, the cultural backgrounds, economic backgrounds. Each version of silence is unique. And it's unique to our social and cultural intersections. And the end run is that it leaves our mental health untreated and lets us exacerbate issues to the point of crisis. But that path that ends up in the same road of risk of harm and crisis, they come from very, very different and unique places. And so that's what I mean by when we talk about exploring the politics of self-expression, because how we communicate ourselves, happiness, joy, anger, sadness, all these things are sometimes unfortunately dictated to us by the social and cultural stigmas unique to our own personal experiences. So we're going to be diving into a little bit of that as we go into other episodes. We're also going to be doing some segments about education on the history of mental health and self-expression along cultural and social intersections. Plus, we've got some special segments that we put together at the network. We'll have some visits from some of our friends, the network buddies. I think you'll be seeing some of that later tonight. But this is going to be a little shorter episode. As I talked about before, September is Suicide Prevention Month. And with that is a time where we want to normalize mental health discussions year-round, but we use this opportunity where there's a lot of focus and spotlight to try to expand getting people involved in the conversation, getting them started. That's how we can use awareness days and awareness months effectively. It's ineffective if we just say we only talk about topic XYZ during this month and then let it drift away. But for us at the network and a lot of great advocates and experts in the mental health field, this becomes an opportunity, September, to use that spotlight to get people involved in the conversation of getting educated on mental health, getting educated on sort of dispelling stigmas and misunderstandings about it. And the network is proud to do its part in that role. But for tonight, Camp Carl and in the ensuing episodes, we're going to be picking different sorts of subjects and topics that meet those intersections of what does self-expression look like and how do the politics drive silence. And what does that silence look like? Tonight, though, we're going to keep it pretty simple. We're going to be talking with some guests who endeavor in the world, because when we talk about self-expression, it's not just painting, dancing, and singing. And when we talk about mental health, it's not just talking about trying to learn whether you have a diagnosis like bipolar disorder or limiting to that there's only one kind of trauma. Mental health is comprehensive, and mental health care is comprehensive. You can't have an effective conversation if you're not willing to talk about social issues that impact our quality of life and our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Housing safety, access to food, physical safety inside of your community spaces, whether that's in a school or on a street corner. When we talk about different types of civic supports, whether legislation plays a role in impacting your quality of life, whether you want it to or not. When we talk about taxing policy, there's things that are directly happening in our societies that impact how we navigate mental health, whether it's the one-to-one of funding for a mental health clinic or the idea of how do we create a civic structure that can safely respond to someone who's in the middle of a mental health crisis in a public space. So that's kind of the over-under. And our guest today is someone who's deeply engaged in social politics and society at large in ways that has a very unique perspective. And that's one of the things we like. And we're going to be talking with our guest Nelson in a little bit. But we have one little segment we're going to show. Like I said, this is going to be kind of a pretty minimal episode where we're just sort of wanted to get it up and running. But from time to time, we get visited from our friends, the network buddies, and they've appeared on a few other shows before, and you're going to be seeing more content from them as time goes by. But we're just going to roll to a little segment from our friends before we talk with our next guest. So let's see what the network buddies are getting up to right now.
Hey, Jester, what does stigmas mean?
You never heard of stigmas?
Nope.
You ever feel like you can't talk about how you're feeling?
Yeah, sometimes I don't feel good, but I don't want to say something because I feel silly.
You're not alone, Blooper. Many people feel like they're supposed to hide their feelings. Some can feel silly, even ashamed. It's like their own fault for feeling bad.
When I feel down, I don't want to talk because everyone around me seems fine. I don't want to bring them down.
Things that make us feel bad to talk about our mental health are stigmas.
Oh, I get it. But who made stigmas, sister? Like, where do they come from?
Stigmas try to control how we express ourselves. And when it comes to mental health, stigmas are false beliefs about how mental health works.
But sister, who makes stigmas? When did I catch them?
Stigmas don't come from one person or place. We all have inherited stigmas through social and cultural factors.
Social and cultural factors.
We all get stigmas by false beliefs about mental health being repeated by friends, family, and in pop culture like TV.
How do I stop from catching stigmas, sister?
It's not someone's fault for being influenced by stigmas, but we resist stigmas by understanding that our mental health is a natural part of life. And having a mental health challenge is just the same way in any other part of our body is unwell.
You mean like if I catch a cold or get hurt falling off my bike?
Exactly. There are many things we can do to take care of ourselves. And there are professionals who can help us with mental health challenges. In fact, the Hope First Network's mission is to help folks like you and I learn this early signs of mental health challenges. And so we can do something about it before it leads to harm or complications in our lives.
Early signs.
Remember Blooper how stigmas make us silent?
Yep.
It's common for people to hide their mental health challenges until it feels like it's too much and they reach a point of crisis.
Well, if so many of us are impacted by stigmas, that makes us hide our mental health. It's almost like there's a culture of concealment.
Yes, Blooper. You could say when it comes to mental health, we all live in concealment culture.
So, the network wants to help people address their mental health before they get to the crisis?
Exactly, Blooper. Proactive prevention is all about disrupting mental health challenges from escalating.
Oh, awesome! How can I join?
You can become proactive by connecting with the Hope First Network.
I really want to make a difference.
Together we can. Come on, I'll help you.
Well, that's the network buddies. Shout out to Paul Hay and his network buddies. We'll be hearing from more content from them in other episodes when we add more segments. But today, we're keeping it kind of simple. We've got a guest with us who's going to be joining. And as I mentioned at the start of this, we really wanted to sort of create an opportunity for a discussion where we're deep diving into different sort of intersections. But there's no one conversation that's going to get it all done. So we tend to think of this as doing small bites. And we're just going to see where it goes and try to make sure that we're providing content where it's informative and it helps illustrate and demystify things. But I think it's also important to make sure that we hold space for people to sort of share their perspectives and create an opportunity where it's not just talking at the camera and factoids, but kind of just letting the conversation open up and go where it goes. So with that said, our first guest, you'll get the full introduction, is Nelson. They're a podcast host, local activist, former camp counselor, and a political scientist as well as a teacher. So let's have Nelson come on. Nelson. Hey, buddy.
Hey, buddy.
I hope you don't mind me stumbling all over myself early today. But
no, it's beautiful.
Nelson, thank you for joining us. And before we dive into much, please give us your formal introductions.
Hey, everybody. My name is Nelson. He, him. I was born and raised in Alabama. I still live in Alabama. I hold a bachelor's and master's degree in political science. I'm currently a teacher, and I am one of the hosts of the podcast What's Left of the South, a podcast about Southern working class history and current events from a leftist perspective. So a different perspective of the South. And I really liked what you had to say about resources, Carl. We can definitely go into that because there's a lot of things that definitely impact people's lives and mental health here because of lack of resources.
And I think we're just going to dive right in there. Dive right in there, not jive right in there. Because, we'll talk about how we know each other and all that stuff in a minute, but What's Left of the South I thought was really fascinating. I love the title. It's
it's a little punny, right? Because it's
Yeah.
like what's left. Okay,
Yeah.
but what inspired you to start it?
So, we started the podcast back in 2019. October 2019 was our first episode. So, touching into a little bit of how we met, being from the South and then going up north to work or to just go to the camp that we were both at. I would get asked like some of the most ridiculous questions, and it really got annoying after a while. Myths and rumors and all this stuff about once I would let out a bit of my Southern draw instead of some Alabama, like all these preconceived notions came about. And I understand that because a lot of people that look like me have like horrible politics. But around that time in 2019, a lot of people were getting interested in like Southern politics and wondering like what was going on and everything. And there wasn't really any outlet for that other than like some stuff you'd hear in mainstream media. So I got together with some friends and decided that we need to give a different perspective, a different narrative about the South and what it's all about. Because a lot of good people down here doing a lot of great work, and we've changed a lot over time. We've actually changed the name, we've changed hosts, we've gotten better in my opinion, and we're still going. We're still going strong, and we're really growing and really changing people's minds and kind of tying it into the whole to the mental health thing. I thought like going in, our biggest crowd would be people people not from the South, have never been to the South, like changing their minds. But a lot of people that messaged me and tuned in were what I call from the Southern diaspora. Like they had to leave the South for a number of reasons, for political reasons, because of LGBTQ. They were tired of like racist people. They had to leave for economic reasons, and a lot of them want to come back, but they can't for a number of reasons. And they would message me and they would say, you know, I'm really thankful for your podcast, and I'm really thankful that there's people out there that are trying to change minds and really tell the story of what the South is. And that's not all racists and bigots and backwards politics. There's good people here fighting for good causes. And that was one group that messaged me. And the second group that really hit home were people in really small towns and areas of the South that have liberal to left leaning politics that are like, hey, I'm in a town of like 200 people and it's all Trump supporters. And I'm the only one. And I didn't think there was anyone like me. I didn't think there was anyone that sounded like me that had my politics. And they'll message, and it makes, I could have like the worst day ever. I could be like, this podcast, and I don't want to work and it's a good thing. But like that, like someone like that will message me, and I'll be like, all right, it's all worth it. If like one person like that messages me, it's worth it. Because the fact that like we're tapping into a community that desperately needs like a voice, that's been very, very that's very powerful to me. And I was just like, I'm really happy that we have listeners, not just all over the country, but all over the world, that are mostly, you know, people that have left the South and say, hey, I'm glad that you're doing a good thing. I wish I could come back, but they can't for a number of reasons. And then people that still live in the South and very rural areas are like, hey, I'm thankful for y'all doing this. And then there are people that have been like, hey, you've changed. I'm a Yankee from wherever, and you've changed my mind. So that's kind of where we started and where we are, and we hope to continue because it's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of things that you just touched on there that would be kind of important to talk about. One of the things that can be really uncomfortable for people, especially in the nonprofit universe, is, you know, both on paper and in reality, we're apolitical and secular.
Mm-hmm.
But the things that you have to recognize is that the reality is, you know, it's a privilege when people can say that there's their life and then there's politics, because all things end up being, whether politicized or end up in the arena of civic management, which people might call politics. You know, and why that's relevant is that as an organization that's dedicated to mental health, and a lot of nonprofits that are in the peripheral, you have to operate in the reality of building a society based in inclusion, and meaning that you're trying to navigate and figure out solutions from the base set of inclusion, that we've got to all make this work, all get in on this. And 20 years ago and backwards, there was a place where things like what people would call the sort of the illusion of the both sides or whatever and beyond could function, because the attitude of inclusion wasn't, even the word inclusion nowadays is polarized into or politicized. But the idea of inclusion was just trying to not navigate agreements and disagreements, but fine, we're under the basic template that like we're all going to be here, even if we're not necessarily going to be friendly with the person across the street. And unfortunately, a lot of things have happened that there's always been this theory that you can build a society by exclusion. And that's never, ever gone away. And someone who believed in inclusion could be what we would recognize as rabidly racist. You know, they do believe in inclusion, but it's going to have a hierarchy based on the content of your skin color and pigmentation, and bigotry based on the religions you abide, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We live in a time now where it's become very much to the forefront that there are mindsets who navigate believing that it's either got to be we're a society of inclusion with debating like how we decide who's in and out, versus there's a mentality of exclusion, which is a little different. And why I'm saying that is to get to the point of, I love the way you talk about going up north and Yankees versus the South and the Southern diaspora, because coming back to this idea with the social and cultural intersections and the politics of self-expression, that's a gigantic, just the idea of Southerner and Yankee has a gigantic, think about what that means. You calling us Yankee, you coming up here, go into a little bit about the questions. I mean, I was there for some of the questions when you were a little kid. But yeah. I mean, well, maybe I should just preface this with Nelson and I know each other because of a summer camp that I worked at and he eventually worked at and attended, and I attended as a teen. And it was in upstate New York. And I also only go on the record saying that, and I've talked about this in other network podcasts that had shaped my life. As a matter of fact, if you see the opening video about me or about us, the thing I talk about with an important conversation in the summer 2006 happened at the summer camp that connects Nelson and I. So, and it's no accident that Nelson it's no accident it's called Camp Carl. That camp was a really big place in my life. I'll talk about that more another day. But Nelson, you're what, 8, 9, 10? Your first time up there?
So 2003, I was 12, and I would have been 13 that fall. So I was 12 years old. I was going into.
Do we have stock footage of it?
Yeah, I was going into. I was going into the 7th grade.
Do we have young Nelson?
Pretty sure.
Oh, maybe.
Oh my god!
Look at those gangsters with attitude. That's my bunk. That's the B6 stage, right?
B6, yeah, B6.
God, there's a B6 Rangers right there.
Oh my god, you're right.
And if anyone can't tell, Nelson is lower left.
Yeah. When I had hair, there's like in the audio for some reason.
Yeah. Oh, I do have it. I do hear.
Oh, there we go. There we go. But yeah.
So okay, we can give you that picture. Thank you.
No, it wasn't Rangers. It wasn't Rangers. We were B6. We were B6 Jackass because Jackass had just come out. Remember?
Jesus, yes.
We were
B6
right. Jack, and then the skit was it. It was what was the one that did amateur wrestling? And one of you guys
That's
like
B5.
no, it was B6. I promise you, it would be B6. We were jacket. I remember seeing the plaque that we made on the wall.
Oh my God, you're right.
We were the jackasses. And I remember that it was Jamie Silverberg, right? Jay Silver, he got speared like onto a mattress for like some skit. He's like, I'm Jamie, so welcome to Jackass or whatever. And boom, because like I think the first movie had just come out.
You know what? You're absolutely right, but I think it's because B5 and 6 did theirs together.
Oh yeah. We did do ours together, yeah, because B5 and B6 were two of the standalone cabins. Usually it was yeah. Oh my God.
There you are, as dimensions of the camp. At its peak, you could have anywhere from 300 to 400 campers, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it was
6
from what I heard from in 07 at its height.
Its peak.
When we were both there, there was 300 staff and about
oh Jesus, you're right.
There was 700 kids. It was something ridiculous. Like they had a waiting list and they had to move counselors out of the they had to open up B18 and then they had to move the specialists out of the cabins and put them in other places to sleep.
That's right.
Bring
That's
in more
right.
kids.
That's right.
It was like 700, 800 kids and like 300. It was like 299, 300 staff for like 700 kids. It was a madhouse. There's a reason why it's not around anymore. Like, so it was insane.
And to color that experience, demographic wise, it had a really fantastic value of there was about 30, 40, 50% American staff and then international staff, which was a cost cutting measure, but it's another topic. And the attendance, the campers were majority East Coast, north to south, East Coast, from Florida to New York, sort of coastal. But you did have a healthy smattering of people from the Southeast, not so much the Central South, Southwest, and a little bit of the West Coast. Very few. The Midwesterners was underrepresented. So there you are, Nelson. You come up there, and you meet kids who, a lot of those kids, your contemporaries, aren't familiar, haven't ever met anyone from the South. So I think this is an interesting just dichotomy. Same skin color, but completely different universes.
Completely different, yeah.
And what was the sort of like, what can you remember about because I mean, just talking about this idea of the Yankee in the South for a second.
I'll have a specific, and I want to know if you remember this conversation. It was 2007. And I was like B16, right? And you were across the way, I think, in B on boys game. You were in B7 and 8, I think. You were on the porch. And someone brought up how they didn't like NASCAR, and I'm defending NASCAR, and then you chimed in with like the greatest defense of NASCAR, and I'm just like, thank you. I was like, thank God someone else is, and you had like the most elaborate, beautiful defense of NASCAR. You were like, you try taking a turn at 200 miles an hour with a car that's lighter than a car that's on the road, and blah 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 blah. I was just like, I was like enamored. I was like, he said everything I want to say, but like I couldn't put it into words. And it was like it was like that specific like Carl answer that's just like you can't rebut it because it's so spot on and detailed. And I was just standing there like he's right. And other kids were like, but so I'll never forget that. That's one of the conversations I remember we had in 07 that I'll never forget. It was like your defense of NASCAR. It was the first time I heard someone else outside of the South defend NASCAR.
Yeah. And that was really, I had the privilege of, my brother was into racing, my older brother was into racing, and I'd see him watch the races, and that's how I learned, and I appreciate a fast car.
Going left.
And I think one of the things I talked about was driving at like 200 miles closer than you park in the grocery store parking lot.
And you meant the cars are smaller and lighter than regular car. Like you can't.
I'm stealing all my lines from Darryl Waltrip talking about racing. You know what I mean?
Yes. Oh my God.
But I think an interesting thing there is putting that into like if you think about it, when we talk about mental health in a self-expression context, what you know of is like normal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And people, you got kids, and I remember kids treating you like you came from Mars, from the drawl to the way that what's normal for you in terms of certain cultural things, from how dinner works and the food you eat for dinner versus the TV you watch, the music you listen to, the whole country concept, like country music thing. Everyone assumes you must love country music.
Oh my god. The biggest ones I do have to say I do like country, and I've gotten back then I didn't appreciate it because, and it's funny, like going back to how to tie this in. It was like not appreciating things about yourself, or like trying to hide things about yourself because you wanted to fit in. And like I did like country music, but like it was so stigmatized, especially after 9/11 with this whole like nationalist rhetoric, Saddam and woo, like it was just bad. But I remember like I did like a lot of country, and I'm glad that now it's definitely more like the alternative country, like old school sound is coming back and everyone's getting into it, and it's more progressive in its politics than it was in the 2000s. The biggest one was walking around barefoot. That was the one I got the most flack for as a camper and as a counselor. Was walking around barefoot. They're like, "Oh, there's Nelson, the redneck walking around barefoot." I'm just like, "What?" It's like 7 a.m. I had to get dragged out for this stupid meeting, or like it's camp. It's just like, who cares? I'm walking around barefoot, and everyone's just like, "How are you gonna walk around barefoot?" I was like, "There's no fire ants up here. There's nothing I have. There's no venomous snakes. There's no fire ants. It's not 110 degrees." That was another thing. I'll get into that in a second. It was like it was literally perfect. And like the only thing you had to watch out for was stepping in dog crap from his dogs, the owner's dogs running around. But like other than that, it was perfect. I was like, yeah, I'm walking around barefoot. I don't want to put my socks and shoes on. Like, I'm sorry. And they were like, they couldn't like wrap their heads around it. It really got me thinking like I grew up in a city in the South, but like we had our family business in the country, and like land in the country and stuff like that. Like walking around barefoot is just like typical, right? But like, and you go down the beach, you walk around barefoot a lot. But it's like I couldn't really wrap my head around the fact that like a lot of these kids like grew up in like the quote unquote concrete jungle. Like they just can't, like in New York, you can't walk barefoot in New York City. So like I couldn't comprehend the fact that these, like a lot of them had never seen a lot of the things that I saw, especially like even the night sky. Like a lot of them were so fascinated with the stars in the sky. I'm like, I mean, I see this every night. Like what? And then I had thinking like older is like, oh, they're around like bright lights in big cities, and you can't see the moon, you can't see the stars. They're not used to campfires and things like that. It was just like, wow. But yeah, I caught a lot of flack for one, like just hinting at the fact that I like country music, but also walk around barefoot was the biggest one. The food and the cultural stuff, definitely the draw, and then like talking about soul food and fried food and a lot of stuff. But like I had a little bit of in because my mom, like she was a camp nurse, but two, she's from New York, so like I had like an in with like I could catch on to some of the references and stuff they were talking about. But when it came to more in-depth stuff, I'm like, I don't know what the hell y'all are talking about. And that y'all was another thing. Nobody used y'all back then except for like the Southerners, and even the European counselors were like, "What are you saying?" I was like, "Y'all, like, what are you talking about?" But yeah, walk around barefoot was the big one. They're like, "Oh, that hick." Walk around barefoot, and I was like, man, I'm not putting my socks and shit. I'll put them on for activities when the kids get around because I want to like break my foot, but like you dragging me out of bed for this morning meeting at like 7:00 in the morning. I'm not putting my shoes on. Sorry.
And that's one of the things that sort of draws into there why I kind of like to stick on this for a little bit, because even as you get to be an adult, and you went back there as a counselor,
that was when the real questions started. That was when the real, like, oh my God. I was like, these damn Yankees.
Well, because people talk, especially if they've never, well, I don't even know if it's never, just, let's say you're Yankee, you're a Northerner. I remember at camp, for instance, the way people would talk to you or have questions for you every once in a while would be the same kind of questions in a way that the kids would ask the African counselors. Okay. So we're talking, there's majority South African counselors.
Oh,
okay?
yeah. I forgot about there's that. Yeah. But
Caucasian ones.
But like for that, like for the people listening, we know, but like you also have to take into account that like these kids were rich.
Oftentimes, yes.
Most of the kids that went there were especially before the housing crisis, were like either celebrity, like a few celebrity kids, and like their parents were in finance, they were loaded, or they had, they were very upper middle class to upper class people. And it's just like they would ask like the dumbest. I remember they would ask the dumbest questions to the foreign counselors.
And I bring up specifically like there's a sort of correlation between the kind of questions Southerners, even the Texas camper counselors, the handful of African counselors that we have, and I mean that by like from countries within the continent of Africa, so South African, and then way less extent. There were a handful of other individuals, mostly was South Africa, and Caucasian from South Africa, which will be relevant in what I'm getting in a second. And the handful of Eastern European counselors who interacted and weren't assigned to like laundry, like not interacting day to day, which is a whole other thing. They would ask you and the African questions, and this is kind of like endemic of modern day. You talk to people who come from different countries in Africa, and they talk with Western folks, acting like you're somewhat devoid of like civic infrastructure and civilization. Right. And I was always marveled at that. I remember so you talking about stuff like you grew up in a city, and there was one or two ones I can remember when you were a camper. Where
03, 07, 08.
The kids, you told some sort of story, and they were just surprised that you had like, I think you talked about like there was a public bus. You had some innocuous story, and a kid asked you like, you got bus systems? And you made some wise ass comment like, there's even like trains and stuff.
Oh, I remember that. I said, yeah, we got a bus. I'm from I'm from Montgomery, and I was like, yeah, we have buses, but I think the last person to actually ride the bus was Rosa Parks, because like the bus system did suck. It was absolutely atrocious. But they would look at me like, you have buses, like you have cars, like I had people ask if I like had indoor plumbing, and I'm just like, what the hell are you talking about? Yeah,
and that's a perfect
ties into the other countries.
Yeah, that's such a perfect drive-in though, because let's just talk about the people who are from the United States talking to another person from the United States. When we talk about cultural and social intersections, it's easy for that to think of people thinking Black people, Latino people, Asian cultures, and those intersections, and LGBTQ intersections, and that kind of thing. Standing in a lineup, you next to another Caucasian person, there wouldn't necessarily be anything that you would think on the face of it could separate your life experiences in the way that a lot of people might think of the superficial characteristics, skin color and stuff like that. But your entire perspective is shaped so dramatically different just by the arbitrariness of your geography. And I mean arbitrary because you didn't pick it as a Ute, and obviously you move around or whatever. But so
what?
Two Utes, which is a great Northeast South. And
I love that.
I want to go back to the other thing about that. A northern perspective of a Southerner has a deep, long history that's shaped by both things like former slave states, but also a general correlation to poverty and low income and unsophisticated and unintelligent. And that can shape someone, just a sort of superficial reaction to someone they meet from the South. Mm-hmm. But that can also color someone from the so-called South's opinion of themselves, and does.
Oh, I got a perfect story for that, yeah.
Right. So this is what I mean by intersections. I mean, how you think of what you're supposed to be and how you express yourself and your identity is dramatically shaped. And we haven't gotten into the things of like racial intersections yet, or economic, your personal possessions. Just we're talking about the geography. What's the story you were gonna? You said you had a story.
Oh, story. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, no, I have a perfect story for that. One of the fans of the show and the social media podcast and all this good stuff. She's pretty popular on TikTok. Her name's Carlette, and she's from Southern Louisiana and has that thick like southern that bayou draw that like this stuff I can't even understand sometimes, like Cajun stuff. Um, and she's a very talented artist, and she got accepted into art school in New York City, and she goes up there and does art school. And she would tell me when she found the podcast and found everything, she would message me and say, I have had to quote unquote code switch basically and give up my southern accent because even though I am like respected in my field and artwork and a very talented high-end art school, like very, very talented artist, the second that draw comes out, people have this preconceived notion that you're stupid. And so she like told me, she's like, I have to basically code switch and give up my southern accent. And she was like, I hate it. She's like, by the end of her time in New York, I remember when she graduated, she tried to set up shop there, et cetera. She was just like, I can't stand it. She's like, I can't stand being here. I miss Southern Louisiana. I missed everything about it. She's like, I hate it. She's like, I hated it for so long. I wanted to get out for so long because of the politics and because of the reactionary and all that stuff. Like, wanted to get out for so long. And she was like, I have to go back. And then she's back in Southern Louisiana, and she's doing art there and has a shop and is doing everything. She's like, I never had the words to express or like could figure out like what I like hated about having to go up north until like I heard the podcast and heard we talk about stuff and everything. And she was just like, told her story. And I was just like, my God, that's horrible. Like having to give up your identity and give up your culture and give up your way of talking just because like, these people thought that you were stupid. And I'm talking about like she's like higher degrees in art, and she's a very, very talented artist. Like I forgot what art school it is in New York, but it's like it's very prominent, one of those big ones. And to just be considered stupid just because of the way you sound, I mean, is ridiculous. And so now she's home back in Southern Louisiana. She loves it. She's like, I really missed it, and I'm glad to be home. But yeah, that goes into like a number of things. Like I really like how you tied it into like in this camp setting, you had me getting asked the same questions as an American, even though I grew up in a different area, the same questions that people have the preconceived notions of people who lived in Africa and Eastern Europe, like they're just poor and backwards and don't know any better. And it's very patronizing way. And some of the questions I got, I can't remember when I was a camper, but as a counselor, I would get questions like the dumbest things, like, you know, do you know any Klansmen? Have you been to a Klan meeting? Like blah 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 blah. I'm just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like I no. It's just like I've lived here for 32 years, and I have not once seen a Klan rally. I've never met a Klansman. Like, they're not a thing. Like they're there, but they're in like the backwood shadows. Like they come out every once in a while and like throw pamphlets in people's yards, and we make fun of them. Like it's stupid. And then it's I'll see on the news like in heavy in blue states, they're like they have more problems, it seems like, with far right activists and groups and stuff than I've ever seen. But like it's I tell people when people are like, oh, the South is blah blah blah, I was like, we've progressed. Like we're not the foaming at the mouth racists anymore. We've progressed to the New England style racism that everyone is comfortable with in the United States. So like don't come at me with this stuff when like we integrated our schools like 20 years before Boston did. Like let's not forget what happened when all those Irish had to integrate their schools in Boston. They rioted. So like it's just a number of things that like really not trying to be like a Southern apologist, because you definitely have a lot of problems. But what the thing, it goes like this: is just like if you have problems in your own family, you handle them, and you don't want other people that don't know what they're talking about to give you their really dumb opinion on what's going on. And it's just like you don't know what you're talking about. Like I grew up in a majority black city in a majority black county. And the South. It's just like when some of these kids that came to camp had never seen anyone besides a rich Caucasian person in their entire life. I was like, the South is one of the most diverse regions, if not the most diverse in the United States. So it's just like, I don't know what y'all are getting at, but it was just,
Well,
it got
that's-
really annoying. So you're coming up with different comebacks and having to deep dive into history and be like, hey, that's not true. This blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it was a bunch of, welcome to my TED talk about the South. But yeah, it was definitely an experience getting asked a bunch of dumb questions.
Well, and I appreciate you sharing that because, and it's I understand the TED Talk idea of the South because moving away from, the camp experience, one thing, but obviously with the podcast and your current work, that is an important topic to talk about. And what we're gonna talk about right now, just in general, is the idea of the South, and especially in the digital age, an outward perception of sort of the broad scope, what general society thinks, does matter in a way that, like, when local news was local, and so whatever they saw in Dallas on Dallas news wasn't what you saw in Birmingham news, and wasn't what you saw in Detroit news. But now that we're in a place where it seems like, or it is, all news and all information sort of is like everyone gets to be in it. Everyone gets to,
Yeah.
right? The South experiences the historic lineup in the American narrative, right, is that, the dueling one, it got to be a moral story of slavery is conquered and the poor and that Southerners, whatnot. And this line about the South, if you grew up in a northern school, and this is like 50s, 60s, 40s, right? Or into the 80s, 70s, 90s. It has a line, and it's interesting you talk about the type of city demographics you grew up in. It cannot be mistaken that in a sort of mainstream Caucasian-centric northern liberal narrative about the South that looks down at the South, the large populations of Black folks is composite with the poor, ignorant Caucasian folks. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of part of like why it's down there. There's so many of them. But then the whole identity that you see where, like, the melting pot thing, the post-Spanish War thing, right, where it's like we're all one group and we're going to put up a bunch of like Confederate statues to like bring them back into the Union fold, and flash forward to segregation or desegregation, 50s into the 60s and busing into the 70s. It's like this identity that is just presumed for all of you across the board, from Charleston to whatever the furthest western point is on the South. I don't know, Baja, California, I don't know.
Yeah. El Paso or something.
Yeah, El Paso. Is this wayward third world country sort of thing. Backward ass thing. And there's a lot of people, I don't know necessarily, there's not like a fine point to that, but like the way that shapes the mentality and shapes attitudes. When you talk about the pushback and change, what are the things that you really like to highlight when you talk about the South has changed? Because some people could have just heard you right now be like, oh, the South has changed, and people would still roll their eyes and be like, well,
yeah. I mean, yeah. So the quote unquote third world country part of the nation got us to the moon. Let's not forget, like, Huntsville, Redstone Arsenal, Cape Canaveral, Florida. It's just like these, like, it's one thing. It's just like, yeah, we have problems, but now it's like the same problems that everybody else has. It's just like, I've talked to people that are like, yeah, I have friends that like go to Boston or go to Chicago, and they'll be like, they experience like the racism up there that they did not experience here. It's always been, it was like the old saying, like if you talk to like older Black Southerners, they'll say, you always at least knew where you stood in the South. Whereas if you'd go up north, you wouldn't. It would be like you didn't expect it, and it would come out of nowhere. And it's I still hear that today from Black content creators on TikTok, Instagram, etc. That that are from the South that moved away, and they're just like, when people be like, oh, blue states and northern states, they're like, no, I've actually experienced more here than I ever did like back home in North Carolina, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my pushbacks to a lot of things are like, one, George Wallace is dead. He died in 1998. He's not governor anymore. And then like if you really want to get more in depth, you'll go into like how he's an opportunist, and like in the 70s he opened up the state government to minorities faster than the federal government did, and like he did his apology tour in the 80s. I mean, he's still burning in hell because he's an opportunist loser, but like he's still a horrible person and a just disgusting opportunist. But like that's my like opening joke is like George Wallace is dead and he died in 1998 and he's never coming back. They talk about Redstone Arsenal. We talk about Cape Canaveral. We talk about a lot of interracial union organizing in the South, especially in the 20s and 30s and 40s. I'll talk about people like Huey Long or like Big Jim Folsom, who were pushing a lot of economic prosperity across racial lines when they were in power. And I'll talk about how every single state in the South, except for South Carolina, sent men to go fight for the Union. I'll talk about, if you get really in depth, Eastern Tennessee, 40,000 men fought for the Union in Eastern Tennessee. They broke away from the Confederacy. We're not going to fight for the Confederacy. We're going to fight for the Union. And you talk about, that Matthew McConaughey movie that came out, Free State of Kingdom of Jones, with Newt Knight. And you have to. The thing is, if people want to listen, that's like what the podcast is about, because we go more in depth into a lot of things. Both my co-hosts now are indigenous, so they'll go into the indigenous history of the South, and we'll talk about a lot of different cultures and different aspects and different things that people don't know about, especially outside of the South. And so it's really trying to tell people like, hey, we were all lied to when it came to history class, and we were all lied to about, these certain narratives that are pushed, and trying to break those narratives and break the stigma, and trying to break like this whole perception that everybody down here is just like some good old boy foaming at the mouth racist with a pickup truck. And it's just like, it's not true. There was a lot of people that are trying to do good work in all aspects of life, not just political, but also social change and economic, and going outside the system, because a lot of times, especially in the South, like a lot of other states, it's very hard to work within the system. So trying to do stuff like through nonprofits and et cetera to like help people. One example is in the Black Belt in Lowndes County, in Dallas County, there's a huge problem with sanitation and sewer work. And like a lot of people straight pipe their waste into the yards, and people get sick, and it's just disgusting. And so people came together, nonprofits, to a big one came together to get the one that they started in Lowndes County, got a big grant, and now they're helping people get septic tanks and like actual proper waste management. So yeah, I mean, there is some truth. There's like little grains of truth to like what people say about the South and the quote unquote third world country stuff. But like, another example is when I was a counselor at the camp, we would take the bus. Everyone, like, that bus ride from Port Authority up to Liberty, right? I would go through like the Catskills in New York, and I was just like, why am I seeing Confederate flags? Why am I seeing a ton of Trump signs? I was just like, am I like in Alabama or am I in New York? I was like, everyone's like, oh, I was like, go outside the walls of this camp. This is exactly like, this is New York. This could literally be like slap out Alabama. I was like, there's no, like, the only thing here is just like everybody has a different accent than down south. There's no difference. But the fact that y'all are like, oh, the South, blah, blah, blah. I was just like, I've seen all of this back home, but this is in New York. What's your point? It's like,
that's a really good
crazy
way to sort of illustrate it, is that, especially with using the dichotomy about racism and the way that it's manifested in different regions of the country, that's a really good, very visible proxy for a lot of different parts of how we take care of ourselves and how life manages itself. And we'll talk about mental health in a one-to-one. But a traditional characteristic for racism, for instance, is that if it's systemic everywhere, it is. The way it operates itself in a Southern style, which gets popularized and talked about, and it seems really overt, doesn't take the sort of genteel way that happened in the northern so-called free state cities, where there were social covenants, but there wasn't really the big sign on the drinking fountain. So redlining, which happened everywhere, but it was uncouth to talk about redlining, and it was a more of a for their own good sort of thing. You bring up Chicago, and Chicago to this day is hands down the most segregated city in America, in ways that people wouldn't necessarily be able to understand what segregation means, because it's not just there's a staticness to ethnic groups regionally. That you can see just about almost any urban space or any space in America. You can see places where Group X has historically always been permitted to live and things like that. But when people talk about that, that's not something I say alone. When people, Chicagoans and experts, talk about segregation in Chicago, it's also like a social policy. Earlier this summer, for instance, there was this whole thing about Black youth downtown causing a little mini riot. It was like in June or May, one of the first really warm days up here. And it made the national news because there were scenes of kids jumping on cars, and so people got beat up, assaults happened and everything. But what people forget or wouldn't care about, okay, is that all that started is not because the kids were causing trouble or da-da-da-da-da. There were all these think blogs and punditries about where the parents and what are you doing after school programs. Okay, but here's the thing. The kids that showed up, some of it tied to like social media blast outs, and they were just in Grant Park, or the general promenades down along Michigan Avenue. Public parks, everyone's allowed to be there. Okay. And that's that. They were there. And that the problem started when the CPD started pushing the kids to go to the trains. Okay. Now, you say like, okay, well, sure. But you're not asking the question, and the news didn't ask the question. And even people who are advocates to support giving spaces for youth, Black youth, and any other kind of youth, didn't even think about it because it's so Chicago that they didn't think about what actually happened. Okay, what actually happened, which caused the cops to move the teens to the trains to clear them, is that there were a bunch of Black teens on Michigan Avenue. That was it. It wasn't that they were wilding out and causing problems. They hadn't had a chance to do that yet if they were going to do that. But the sight of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 Black people in one area, and they weren't there as a church convention, there to go to the concert venue, they were just milling about, as teens are wont to do. That's it. That was enough. Cops rallied up. People came.
Yeah.
People called the cops. And because that's the way, that's what actual segregation is. That many Black people, and this is the tourist center of the city, okay? And you need to understand, again, Chicagoans themselves didn't even question, 60, 70 young Black, because there were way more than that when it was all said and done. But it took the first 60 or 70, and Chicagoans themselves were like, all right, they down here. You see what I'm saying? So it's not like they were in like, they weren't in like the Gold Coast gated area where almost nobody but people who are well, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like they were on some specific street where like there shouldn't be a mass gathering, or even like a place where teens shouldn't necessarily be. Okay, they were in the tourist walking around pedestrian center of the city, but that many of them was the trigger point. And then as soon as the cops started corralling them to the trains, then all hell breaks loose because the kids get, angry and frustrated and annoyed because it's cops, and it also heightens the sense of anarchy. So that idiots do idiot shit. The violence part is there, but it's like a pressure cooker. It got turned into that. And again, if you revisited it, it's so ingrained that no one even stopped to question, why did the cops even try to move the kids? Because every report, every cop report, every eyewitness report was as the kids are being corralled out of the park across Michigan towards the trains on the Wabash. Oh, no, that's not the right street. I'm to the train system. That's where the violence, civilians got beat up wrongfully. Some windows got smashed. People jumped on cars. There was a number of shootings, at least 2. I think people died. There was arrests. You see what I'm saying? That happened in the motion of the cops trying to push these people. And at no point did any Chicagoan question, because you wouldn't, call on the cops. I don't know if you saw 50 young black teens anywhere in the city outside of their area, the black area. They get if they're in Wrigleyville and they did that, the cops would show up. If they were in Lincoln Park, if they were in so anyway, coming back to it about in your experience, and one of the values and cool things about the podcast is that if you're an individual growing up in the South, you are principally shaped by these attitudes about what people think of you. And how you express yourself, from the minute you're born and the minute you become, 8 to 9, you're a teenager and older, how you're trying to shape yourself and how you communicate who you are and da-da-da-da. You have a whole baggage of history that's centuries plus that you inherit, that you can reject it all, but even that becomes an issue in your community. And this is for anyone on the globe, but just staying focused in your personal experience. Like, what you actively literally try to push back against is a history that shapes hundreds upon thousands of people's identities. And that does bleed into ultimately our mental health, your thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and how you shape them and how you're supposed to communicate them. And we haven't gotten to talking about things like depression or bipolar or whatever. I'm just talking about how you communicate what you're interested in, what your passions are. What gets Nelson excited when he wakes up in the morning? Could be impacted by this belief of like a real Alabama man's supposed to be like this, or a real Southern's supposed to be like this.
No, yeah, exactly. You hit the nail on it's your way with words has always been amazing. But no, you're exactly right. And it's frustrating because on one end, and I do want to be clear, I'm not an apologist for the South, and I'm not complaining as like a white man, oh, woe is me. But I'm saying like it is frustrating from my perspective and how I've grown up. From one, you get pushback from the good old boys, right? I have deeply Southern side of my family that is like the typical what you would expect to be the upper class Southerners, the racist, that aspect, like, and having to walk that fine line and fight back against that and be like, no, it's not blah, 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 et cetera. It's having to argue with them at Thanksgiving, right? Or any family gathering, or just growing up and hearing horrible things and having to, be like, that's not what I want to be. And you're trying to change and push back against that, all while the second front is coming in from quote unquote Yankees saying that, oh, you're bad and you're stupid and you don't know what you're talking about. It's just like I'm getting at you, like anyone in the South who has any sort of left of center politics is getting like a two-sided war almost against them. From one, the old South that is coming at you for not being like them, and then Yankees and people outside the South pushing at you because they think that you're like the old South, and like they think that you're dumb and ignorant and racist. And it's just like, and it does wane on you. And it's just like, there's a number of times I've wanted to throw my hands up in the air and be like, what am I fighting for? Like, why am I doing this? Like, why do I care so much? Like, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. And then that's when I'll get a message from somebody being like, hey, I live in like middle of nowhere, Georgia. Not, and everyone thinks of Georgia as Atlanta, but there's some parts of Georgia that like I don't even want to go to. So like, and I live in a town of 200 people. The whole like, you know, that lives in the Jason Aldean. Try that in a small town, but like hates Jason Aldean, right? And they're just like, hey, I listen to your podcast on ball. Thank you so much. I love your content. I love your stuff. I love what your co-hosts have to say. That particular bit was funny, and I learned so much. I'm surrounded by Confederate flags and racists, and your podcast and what you all say has helped me in my like mental health and gets me up out of bed in the morning. And that helps me. That like gets me out of that slump, because I think anyone who's a creator, whether it be a digital creator, an artist, like any sort of creator, is going to have that pushback. But it's just the unique perspective, my perspective, as being a white male Southerner that's supposed to wear cowboy boots, that's supposed to, you know, vote a specific way, that's supposed to have these like these mind made up on certain issues and be shitty, right? And I'm not that. I don't have the belt buckles. I don't wear the boots. I don't like. I do have a Bass Pro hat and Pit Vipers because I like my Bass Pro hat and Pit Vipers, right? And I do want to have a truck, and I do like shooting guns, but like I don't like Donald Trump. And so it's like, yes, I know how to drive a tractor, but no, I don't know any Klansmen. It's just like the duality of this, like the drive-by truckers have like coined it the duality of the Southern thing. And it's so beautiful, and like that's perfect, because it's like, yeah, I mean, I can do this, this, and this. That doesn't mean I like this, this, and this. And it's like you tell that to people and their heads explode. It's just like, what? What do you mean? Blah 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 blah. I was just like, yeah, it's just, it's frustrating. And what gets me out of bed and what gets me excited now is being able to teach at a level where I can like dispel a lot of myths and like talk about things. And the podcast definitely, my friends from that, and just getting out and being able to just teach, not just in the school setting, but teach on the podcast and this stream, and like any sort of place where you like just say a platform, be like, hey, this is what we're about. And like it's always great bringing on the podcast people that have a different perspective, that are from the South, that have a different perspective and like a certain feel. Like we have one member of the Lumbee tribe from North Carolina. We've had indigenous people on. My co-hosts are indigenous. We had black activists on. We had the co-founder of the Young Patriots, Fred Hampton, Chicago, right? He lives in Huntsville, Alabama. We had him on the show talking about what it was like growing up in Uptown, like being from Appalachia and then growing up, like moving to Uptown and the Young Patriots and the Black Panthers and all that stuff. We had him on, and it's just like it's that's what really gets me going is the education and the teaching and the support that we as a podcast get from either the Southern diaspora or those living in areas of the South that are like a third world country, that are backwards, that do have a lot of outside the cities, that do have a lot of problems, that are still stuck in a lot of the old South ways, and helping them out. So that's what really gets me going.
And that's beautiful. And I respect the old South way, but maybe it's just old America kind of way.
Yeah.
You know, there's enough places above the so-called Mason-Dixon line that, you know, I mean, and maybe even using terms like third world countries pejorative to countries.
Yeah. Like one of the, you're right. One of the most racist people I knew in my life was my grandfather, but he was a Guinea from Boston. He moved down to Montgomery and thrived on his racism. Like he was like him and my racist Southern grandmother were two peas in a pot. Like it was like some of the most disgusting racist things I ever heard were from the son of Italian immigrants from Boston. It was just like, it was wild.
One of the things that really jumped out, especially with talking about your podcast, and I think we're going to have you on this again because we're going to wind this down in a little bit. But
yeah,
what you're doing is actually pretty essential because again, when I opened up this episode talking about mental health, it's not, and this, we have to break through this idea of a one-to-one correlation that's just talking about prescriptions or talking about wellness or just talking about suicide prevention, the comprehensive thing. Being able to break people's silences about their perspective on the Southern experience. I love that you call it the Southern diaspora. That has a monumental way of impacting somebody's ability to communicate. Your thoughts, feelings, and emotions aren't just impacted by someone talking about, oh, mental health is your imagination, or real men don't cry, real boys don't cry. Believing senses about your identity of who you are through your culture and being able to break apart or embrace parts of the things that we grew up from or shape your perspective and your worldview are essential to shaping our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And talking about the individual you mentioned who went to school in New York, from Louisiana, and other people who have been impacted by your podcast, our journeys through communicating and embracing our own mental health, again, aren't just simple and linear of whether you were in a car crash or you were bullied or went to war or combat. People feeling a strong disconnect between their physical space and place has a profound effect on attitudes about your self-esteem and confidence and belief about your capabilities and wherewithal in life. And you being able to create a space where people can embrace and not feel ashamed. Because to be clear, I'm glad we can't not talk about racism with the South, but that's also part of the problem, is that one of the things, for instance, as a trope that the North did is they sort of exported or offloaded all the racism to Mississippi and Alabama, to some Klansmen, some lynchings, and said, you know what? That's where that whole story is. And we're not going to talk about Dodger Stadium in California. We're not going to talk about a riot in Cicero. We're not going to talk about busing anywhere.
Oh my God.
Okay.
We're not going to talk about like how if anyone north of 116th Street in Harlem ever came down past that, what would happen to,
We're not going to, but that has a critical effect. And I go back to the ideas of self-esteem. People can be walking around, and we'll use as an example in the South, people could be walking around just feeling like a less than worthy person. And they don't have the academic deep dive for it. But if you put it on like an emotional map, part of the feeling like less than and worthless is the fact that they identify as a Georgian, an Alabama, and a Southerner, or what have you. And it's not that their grandpa, their mother, their father, their brothers and sisters, their school teachers didn't do that to them. But they're fed pop culture and media and jokes and all these things that shape them. So they say, I grew up in this area of Alabama. And even though it's not omnipresent, I'm not walking past a billboard that says I'm a piece of shit. Somehow, existentially, I feel kind of shitty about myself. And people want to walk a fine line there and be like, okay, what does that mean? But, the things that compel us to try to make ourselves feel better and change isn't just running away from big visible trauma, okay? Which is a part of the mental health thing, big visible things, okay? But the subtle things, the granular things that fill our soda bottle of pressure over years and decades, when we're talking about those things, they manifest in ways that why you take an extra drink, why you eat an extra bit of food, why you're doing things to kind of satiate your self-worth and being, even though you don't have some like very visible toxic person, and that's not why you're doing it. But somehow, existentially, you just feel like a piece of shit. That is not an accident of the propaganda or the media content that shapes, in this case, which we're talking about the South. So the fact that you can sit on a podcast and push back without excusing or apologizing for the realities, but the story is not just the realities, and it's almost frustrating that you can't do a TV show, a movie, a TED Talk without apologizing for the South before celebrating your Southern. And that has a gigantic shaping factor on someone's self-esteem, which ergo has a 1-to-1 correlation with the presence and status of your mental health. So you do an essential thing, even if in the classical way we talk about mental health, people can't see the 1-to-1 with what you're doing. You know what I mean?
No. Yeah. Damn it.
You're doing good shit is what I'm saying.
I got you. It's just like you said, you hit the nail on the head again, like so many times. I realized that like every time I like try to talk, it's just like, all right, look, I'm not saying that blah, blah, blah. Because that's the first thing that comes out of people's mouths are like, oh, it's just like, you try to say, hey, the South isn't that bad. And like, what are you talking about? This. I'm just like, there's a lot more nuance to that. And it's like having to, get up and say, I'm from the South. I'm sorry. It's just like, it does get draining a lot, especially when you're not a part of what people perceive as like the South and like being Southern. And, you get told so many times, like, oh, you must fuck your cousin and you're all inbred and stupid. You start like, all right, whatever. Yeah. Whoop-de-doo. It's just like, it does weigh on you a lot, especially when you go up north, or I hear the dumbest stuff like from other people. It's like, it's one of those things that's like, it does drain on you. And I had other friends from other parts of the South that didn't grow up in southern cities, that are from like what you would like the holler, and they're from Appalachia. They're from like the very rural places. And they're just like, everyone just thinks that they're just dumb, toothless, inbred idiots. And it's just like, no, they're not. They're very smart. They're very active. They're very everything. They're diverse in their sexual orientation, they're diverse in their race, they're diverse in their cultures and ethnicities and nationalities. And it's just like, it is devastating to be pegged as like something that you're not. And it does weigh on you time and time again when you hear it in not just pop culture, but you hear it from other people, when you hear this whole idea of like what you're supposed to be. Like, I'm not that. Like, stop telling us that we have to be this. Like, we're not that. We're not our fathers. We're not our grandfathers. We're different. It's like, this is the new South. We're trying to fix it. We're trying to make it better, but y'all aren't helping. I would tell like people, I've said on the podcast before, is it's like, Yankees, like, if you really care so much, shut up and give us your money. Like, give us all your blue state resources and your money to help these nonprofits and to help these people and activists doing work down here. It's just like, put your money where your mouth is. Stop saying they're all a bunch of stupid inbred racist hicks, and donate to a solidarity fund, donate to a nonprofit, donate to people trying to do work, and stop just complaining. Or fix the problems in your backyard. Like, fix the fact that, like, fix the racist problems with Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and Boston, like, and every other major like Yankee city, is like, fix those problems and we'll handle our problems and you handle yours. And like, stop telling us, it's like people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. It's like, stop telling us, like, we know this. We know there's problems down here. We have to deal with these problems, not just at family get-togethers, but like turning on the news and seeing, oh, Nazis openly marching in Orlando. It's just like, I have friends, and one of my co-hosts is from Orlando, and she's just devastated. She's like, this is disgusting. I hate this. Like, there are good people here fighting back, but no one ever gets that. Everyone's just like, oh, there's like 20 dudes like marching with swastikas. The entire region must be full of Nazis. It's just like, oh my God. it's just, it does drain you. It does weigh on you so much. It's just like, yeah.
And I think that's, I don't think I put as much thought into it as it did when I was saying it, but I do stand by that. I think it's been very helpful to Northeast, South, or Northeast, West to offload its
No, yeah, definitely 100%.
obligations to the South.
That is spot on. Yeah.
But just as we're sort of winding down to that point, is the hypervigilance, the apologizing first before celebrating. That's a signature. If you wash it out and say, well, a person has a tendency to apologize all the time. A person has a tendency to be very hypervigilant, so that any conversation they're having about topic X, Y, or Z, they find themselves having to revisit and qualify and quantify. And in this case, we're talking about South and racism and all that stuff. But if you just do those spot checks, like invasive thoughts, constant hypervigilance, and apologizing, those are symptomatic indicators of trauma. The very persistent communication of defining the South as that X, Y, and Z, and the way even advocates who are trying to actively push back against that, you in this case, it is sort of showing the way there's a cultural traumatization, in the same way that there might be Black folks, racism as a nebulous is one thing, but Black folks fighting against the concept of laziness and slovenliness, okay, by being willing to overwork and be willing to, you always kind of dress your best sort of mentality, right? Are manifestations of a traumatizing social and cultural attitude, And a lot of the things you describe, a lot of what your podcast and your passions about, ultimately are a way of trying to find a healing sense for a traumatizing experience. Racism is not owned to the South, but the onus and punishment, because it's the same way in which slavery is not exclusively a regional discussion, and not just in the molasses triangle thing, but in the more direct. There isn't a single space of antebellum America that didn't profit from slaves. Just because it wasn't them in the field doesn't mean that Chicago's every skyscraper that was there before the fire was financed by slave profit, and every skyscraper in New York and Boston, that was built then, and by continuation, is the profit of a slave. When Black advocates talk about, like, we built these cities and da-da-da-da-da, it's easy for people to think, well, in the abstract, or cotton sales or whatever, but they're not thinking of the financing and the supplying and the whatever. But sticking just to you as we sort of close down, I think it's really important to drive home, to validate what you're doing and your passions, and all the people who are part of that, the co-hosts and the people who call in and you get connected. We don't get better as a society by just continuing to point out what's wrong or apologize for what's been wrong, but trying to actually chart out paths forward. Proactive prevention doesn't work if it's a slogan and a wristband and that's all you've got, and we just tell people to go back to the lifeline. You've got to create tangible systems and practices that you can adopt. What you're doing is a proactive and aggressive way of helping people not, or rather to stop apologizing. You can acknowledge the realities that have been a part of the geography and society that you're part of. You don't have to apologize for them. If you're pushing against them or reject them, then you don't inherit them. So you don't have to say, we're sorry about slavery. Slavery happened and racism happened. Your bag is about embracing, and it doesn't have to be we send someone to the moon. The movement for labor justice that is taking fold, especially among service workers in the South, is outpacing a lot of work anywhere else in the country. Beyond Starbucks, Starbucks stores unionizing. It's really moving it's very impressive what's happening. That's exciting. And then a lot of great social movements have happened that have started in the South. I think that's a beautiful thing to highlight, and you don't have to apologize or excuse the Klansmen, not just because there's some in the backyards of Chicago. We hate our Illinois Nazis, but it's that's not the point. It exists because it exists, but we can't eradicate these things just by apologizing for them. You being able to connect people to embrace their heritage, and why does the racist or the illusion of the racist get to have dominion on the land of Alabama or Arkansas or Texas? Why can't you, and it doesn't have to be leftist you, why can't you, who's just not trying to fucking harm people based on the illusion of race, be the thing? Like, that's our image, and whatever else, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, I just want to validate what you're doing with the work, because it's essential, it's original, it's unique, and you should be proud of that. And your whole team,
Thank you.
You're making an impact, and that's important.
I appreciate that, Carl. Thank you. That means a lot. It means a lot, especially coming from you. I really appreciate that. I do want to touch on that last comment from SK Ramsky, right? It's so annoying that people saying the South deserves all the bad things that happen. Like, that is the biggest, that's the biggest one. I can deal with like the barefoot jokes or the inbred jokes and the blah blah. I could do, but when the horrible, like when hurricanes hit, when Katrina hits, or when Mary hits, or when Maria or whoever with the hurricanes, when there's an outbreak of leprosy in parts of Florida, when a tornado came through and ripped up parts of Alabama, like right down the road, like right up the road from me, and you hear or there's some horrible natural disaster that happens in the South, and one of the first things you see on social media are people from outside the South saying, "Oh, that's what they get, or that's what they deserve, or that's what blah blah blah," or it's like Jackson, Mississippi doesn't have clean drinking water. It's just like, or this, that, and the third. It's just like we deserve this because of something happens. Like, no, nobody deserves to get leprosy. Nobody deserves to have their livelihood destroyed from a hurricane or a tornado or a wildfire. Nobody deserves to have unclean drinking water because of where they live. It's just absolutely ridiculous, because you don't hear, like, when Sandy hit New York, be like, oh, New York deserves that. Or when something happens in Chicago, it freezes and turns into Antarctica. Like, it doesn't, don't deserve that. When like an earthquake in California, you don't hear, oh, they deserve it. But if something bad happens in the South, it's, oh, they deserved it. It's like, no, nobody deserves that. Like, there's a number of people that I wish would, just remove themselves or like just disappear in the South to make this place a better place. But I don't want some poor, like, working class yokel to lose their trailer, like, to use their mobile home to a tornado just because they voted for Trump. Like, it's not right. It's just making the situation worse. And for people to be like, hey, the South deserved that tornado, or deserved that hurricane, or deserved that whatever disease that we all thought was eradicated because of the way people voted, or the way that because of our history, it's just absolutely stupid. It's just completely asinine, and it's disgusting. It's just like, no, these people don't deserve this bad stuff that happened to them. This isn't God's judgment. This isn't anyone's judgment. It's just a natural disaster that happened, and it sucks. And no one deserves to have that happen to them.
Man, that's excellent. That's so true. And I think that's a really good place to sort of recognize, especially
because I can't think of any, like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I can't imagine a worse mental health crisis, or worse when you talk about like the proactive, like, mental health, the proactive suicide prevention. I can't imagine a worse situation than, like, literally an hour ago you had all your earthly possessions in your home, and then an hour later it's gone. Like, people don't realize, like, the devastation that, like, hurricanes and tornadoes and in floods, and when the flooding in Kentucky just wiped away entire hollers. Like, it's like your entire livelihood is gone. Everything is gone. Your home, like, your pets, your family, people died. It's just like your memories all the stuff that you could cling on to if you're having a bad day, like a photograph of you and a loved one, like gone because of some natural disaster. And it's going to get compounded by the fact that, yeah, we do have really horrible local and state politicians, but also the federal government doesn't give a shit either. So like the cleanup is going to be hard, but people will come together a lot in the South and fix stuff and try to work and try to help. But like, it's not enough. Then to have on top of that, some damn Yankee being like, oh, you deserved it. I was like, I know plenty of people in the South that did not vote for Donald Trump. And there's a lot of people that were affected that are not Republicans. And there's a lot of people that are just apolitical or just didn't care. And even the Trump supporters and the Republicans, like they don't deserve to have their shit destroyed because of a hurricane, a tornado, or a flood or some natural disaster. But like, I can't imagine a worse situation. Like the only thing that could be worse is like the death, like a parent, like the death of a child. But like that happens in these things too. And then it's compounded. Like talk about the pressure rising of all that happening, one of the worst moments of these people's lives, then being told that like, oh, they deserve it or you deserve it because you were born in Alabama. And we have to remind people, it's like, hey, a lot of these sections of the country that y'all are like cheering on that got hit by a tornado or hurricane are majority minority places. So these people that you claim to love and support, you're now saying like deserve to get killed by a hurricane or a tornado or a flood. It's just like, shut up. It's there's no other way to say it. It's like, shut the fuck up. Like it's horrible. And the fact that people keep doing it is just, it definitely compounds the frustrations a lot of us have down here, and it just makes it worse.
And that's a perfect distillation, though, for, we've been harboring on the way people displace images, north to the south and whatnot. And biggest red flag you can have is the dehumanization of someone else.
Yeah.
And that circles back, I think it's a good place where we sort of wind down tonight. It's just, we didn't start talking about depression or trauma or anything, but here we are in a way that's a full circle directly back to mental health, is that there are attitudes and ways that can perpetuate social and cultural intersections that can lead to things like dehumanizing someone. And that has a profound effect on someone's self-esteem, perception of self-worth. To say nothing, we're not obviously going through the natural disaster or something like that is one thing, but to be able to look out at a society and see an uncaring, whether it's one commenter who's very visible or it's a slew of attitudes or responses that are consistent, that is a incredibly deleterious impact. And that drives home, what we're talking about here at Camp Carl, when I mean the politics of social and cultural intersections with self-expression, who you're supposed to be sad for, how you're supposed to be sad, how you communicate your sadness, your harm, your pain. All those things are shaped by geography, ethnic, economic, cultural norms and values. And if it can even lead to dehumanizing someone in the state of a natural disaster, you're talking about the same systems that can be indifferent and cold to someone who may be at risk of harming themselves, but feels convinced that there's absolutely no one they can safely communicate their pain to, much less you take it up the step to, if we don't have effective mental health services, it's because you can't get elected officials to put legislation ahead, but they can't put legislation ahead. Society doesn't respect or appreciate mental health as a priority to be funded, much less things like civic infrastructure. If you can't even get effective disaster relief planning going, so I think this was an excellent experiment in sort of trying to walk through people, and trying to help people understand the way they need to reorient their mindset. When we talk about mental health, our quality of life is not just impacted by how we think in between our ears, but it's about how we think of others, how we interact with that, what we take from outside world and put it inside of our head, much less the things that we manifest into society at a government, civic level, and an interpersonal level as well. So we could go in 1,000 different directions. Nelson, we're going to have you back on because there's a few other things I want to talk about. I want to get back to the labor movement because that's a huge part of the mental health discussion. And you start to talk about hollers. I'd be here. I mean, talking about some rednecks is a passion of mine. So we're gonna close it down a little unceremonious today. We even have like a cool video to say, but it's gonna be the last thing people see. Is your Nelson picked the segment's called "Hey, check this out."
Oh my god! Yeah,
and it'll be the last thing we show in case we get copyright slammed. So,
yeah.
My last words for the night are going to be: thank you all for joining us because this is a new show. We'll add more segments as we go along, but we've almost clocked in 2 hours, and I feel like it's been substantive. Nelson, you're wonderful. I want to thank our executive producer, Scott Kansky, and our creative director, Christina Bravo, for putting together the graphics and back-end production. Scott, especially. Thank you, brother. And I want to leave the closing words to Nelson. Any closing thoughts? Take us out, Nelson.
Definitely the camp that we were a part of definitely changed my life. And Carl, I'll say this publicly, you definitely helped change my life. You were definitely one of the better, you were probably one of the best counselors, and you were definitely a role model for not just me, but probably a lot of campers. And I think that, little chubby me seeing you on stage doing the splits was like one of the coolest things ever. But yeah, definitely. You definitely helped out the 12-year-old me and then 16-year-old, 17-year-old me. And you're one of the reasons why I wanted to go back and be a counselor and to help kids that were in our same situation. So I just wanted to thank you because you were definitely, I always tell people, I tell people about camp. We were one of the first people that I talk about. I'm glad that we got to reconnect as adults and got to see each other at camp again when you came to visit. And I really appreciate what you're doing. I think this is great. I'm proud of you, and I love what y'all are doing. I think what you're doing is great. And I hope we do get to see each other again in person soon. I want to come back up to Chicago. If you ever come down south, please hit me up. If anyone wants to share the podcast, it's What's Left of the South. We are on Instagram, X now, it's not Twitter, but Threads, TikTok. We can go to the link tree in our bio, any of our social media, and it'll take you to all the places you can listen to: Spotify, Apple, all the good places. It's What's Left of the South, where podcast about Southern working class history and current events from a leftist perspective. And I think that I think people really like it. So what Carl's going to show is every time we had a fire drill at camp, I would yell this out at the top of my lungs.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Love you, Nelson.
Love you, Carl.
You're not cooking. Yeah, I do.
Pork chop sandwiches! Oh, shit!